All right, Dad, I got a few more questions for you. When did you first start getting into Japanese maples?
Well, I was into Japanese maples when I was 8 or 9 years old, riding a bicycle around in the neighborhood, and I was fascinated by these funny little trees that were growing under other trees, or these little seedlings, and they had the bright red leaves on them. And that just captivated me. I just couldn't understand how a tree could have red leaves and be so pretty. And I got permission to dig some of them up in the yard with a pocket knife, and that's how I originally got started. And that's been, well, I'm 74 this fall, so that's been quite a few years ago.
He's been into maples quite a while. Dad started doing the nursery side of it in the 70s. Taught himself to graft, really got into the production of it. You were one of the main guys grafting in this area probably in the 90s. There weren't many people doing grafted cultivars. And then Tim and I went a little crazy with it. What do you think about where it's headed now, Dad?
It's amazing how far it's come from just a backyard hobby to they're making a good living with it, and I'm very proud of my two boys.
We, we've been able to do some fun things. We've really been blessed with the growth of this, but it all started right here in this backyard. Kind of wanted to get on camera and talk to you about what Dad's growing now in his yard, since maybe this area has been reclaimed from previous greenhouses as we've expanded. I wanted to ask you about what's going on with these Christmas ornaments on these tomatoes over here.
Well, I have a niece, and she come in and she says, Norman, put you some Christmas ornaments. They're actually big red Christmas ornaments. Tie them on the tomatoes, and it confuses the birds that want to peck your tomatoes.
Break their beak or
They'll come in
something.
and get aggravated pecking at the Christmas ornament before the tomatoes ripen, and they'll already give up by the time the tomatoes start ripening.
That's funny. Dad, any other garden tips you'd give for people getting into the home garden here? I mean, you've been growing a home garden my whole life. We've been eating good, as you can tell, off this home garden for quite a while.
Well, the main thing is get your garden in early, but not your tomatoes and your cucumbers around here that can't go in the ground till after Mother's Day, because we can always have a late killing frost up to May the 10th in that area.
And we're in western North Carolina. We're actually near Hendersonville. What time of year do you typically start your garden here, Dad? What time do you start tilling it?
I like to till it in the fall and put me I haven't been doing it as much as I'd like to, put some cover crop in like rye or something in the fall to put more humus into the garden, and I'll plow in some black cow humus and stuff like that to get it prepared for the next year's thing. And I like to go through my potato plants, and if you ever have any grass or anything come up, go in and pull it up before it seeds, because if you stop the seeds this year from propagating your garden for next year, so always walk through and pull a weed here and pull a weed there. I stay out of my corn once it starts silking because I don't want it to blow down, and I'll go in later and clean that up after we pick the corn.
What are your main varmint here? I know the one year we had the skunk was kind of a funny story, but are there a lot of animals you're dealing with here? I know we got a fenced-in garden here in the back, so it's not as much as it used to be.
The biggest problem I had was last year especially was I had to plant my corn 3 times, and it was the blackbirds and the crows. They would come in here right at the crack of daylight and go down the rows and pull the corn. I planted 3 times last year, and then the wind blew it down. This year I left all the volunteers there between the rows and stuff, and it kind of confused them a little bit. But I went through and then made my rows distinct and let the corn get, once it got big enough that they couldn't pull it up, they stayed out of it. And we put an old owl up here in the front, and if a crow comes flying by and he sees something like a cat or an owl look like any kind of critter in the garden, he'll fly somewhere else.
Now, Dad, originally you had the garden here, then Tim and I started flooding this area with greenhouses. You moved over to where the nursery is now. How big was your nursery? How big was your garden when you were doing it over at the new location where, say, like greenhouses 1 through 12 are at down low?
I just had a small garden over there with, maybe 4 or 5 rows of corn and some tomatoes. One year we supplied the tomatoes for the tailgate market there, and we started our original maple sandwich giveaway there and celebrate the tailgate.
Dad's been supplying a lot of food. I mean, he's been growing a lot. Now, you started out mostly when you were growing Japanese maples, you were selling at local tailgates, right? That was your main thing?
Well, that's what I did. I actually made enough to buy lumber and stuff building this house. We would gather, I'd dig up 15 to 20 Japanese maple seedlings, ball and burlap them, take them to the local flea markets, and I would sell them $15 to $25 a piece. They would be like a broom handle size up, but they weren't named varieties. They were just seedlings with red leaves, but people loved them.
We started, I mean, some of my first memories with Japanese maples are going to Dreamland Theater in Asheville, which was a movie theater by night and a flea market by day. It's, if you know where Asheville's at, it was actually where the Lowe's is on Tunnel Road. So that whole area there at Lowe's was a big flea market and the Dreamland Theater. And Dad would have ball and burlap. We'd be taking Old Blue out there and selling a ton of seedling Japanese maples out there. And we kind of learned, you know, about growing Japanese maples. And Tim and I mean, I'd be like, you know, gosh, 10, and that'd make him like 4. So we'd be going around buying toys and bringing some side items to sell. You know, we'd be digging some of Mom's flowers out of the garden to sell along with Dad to make us a little bit of comic book and toy money for sure back in those days. But Dad would also do a lot of the local tailgate markets. Like, you'd be at the Brevard tailgate market and the Henderson County tailgate market and even the Flat Rock tailgate market for a while. That was his main thing with Mr. Maple, is he would get out to the local farmers markets. We'd be loading a truck and headed out, right?
Well, a lot of times I would load up an old 91 Buick Century, and I would load up with gallon plants. And the ladies would sit and watch me unload the trees when I set up at the booth. They said, that's kind of like the clown at the circus. They just keep coming out. They couldn't believe I could put many trees in the back of an old Buick Century. But we did, and we made some spending money, and then the boys took the nursery over, and it would get out of their way.
Oh gosh, we kind of took the nursery over around 08 from Dad, and I mean, it was his excuse to get out to the local tailgate markets and talk to people, put a little money, put a little gas in the boat maybe, and just sit back and enjoy it. So we might have stole his retirement plan away and turned it into a little bit more work and business than you were planning on originally. But
well, the nursery was getting so big that I couldn't handle it all myself, and I asked the boys if they want to take the nursery over, and they looked at it and they kind of gave me that question look, and I said, you'll really have to stay busy with it because it's more work than you realize. And they decided they'd take it, so I give them the nursery, and here they are today. Okay, the main thing with growing your squash is give them plenty of room. Now, I had several volunteers come up in my garden from where we'd let some grow too big last year. We just threw them out there. Well, they left the seeds in the ground. They came up. Well, I selected the ones that I wanted to grow in that area, and I let them come on. But originally I wasn't supposed to have but 4 squash, and I've got at least 11 here. But most of them are volunteers from last year that came up, and we just hoed around them and fertilized them and kept them growing. And they're producing it every day. I have to come out here and pull some squash. And I always get 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6, depending how close I picked them the day before. Squash, and I'll have enough to share with my family members, give the neighbors some. And it's always been a labor of love out here growing in the garden. And let me weave through here. You got to be careful when you walk through your squash that you don't break your squash leaves. And we've got basically honeybees and bumblebees and other little bees that come in and pollinate the flowers. If we didn't have the bee population pollinating our flowers, we wouldn't have any produce, because they are our friends.
So Dad, you mentioned bees, and I wanted to ask you just one little brief second. I know you were super into beekeeping for a while. How many years were you doing bees, and how big did that get for your beekeeping?
Well, bees in this area, they don't do well for me because they were doing a lot of spraying and all that with the apple orchards and all that. But bees are very critical for the home gardener, because they're the ones that pollinate your flowers. If you look around here and shake a tree, there'll be some honeybees and some kinds of bumblebees and other little, I don't know what's this bee that don't even sting. It's really not a bee, but it pollinates as well. And if we didn't have the bees, and if you can stop and get still, you can see them come working through on the blossoms. They hit the silks on the corn, they hit the blossoms on your potatoes, and they get in here and work the tomato plants, the cucumbers, and they're pollinating for the fruit. They're pollinating to get nectar and pollen and stuff from the plants to take back to the hives. Years past, I used to have 2 or 3. One time I got to 7 hives, but in one year I even had some good clover honey, and another year I had some sourwood honey. But the bees, you can't tell them what to get out there, so they mix it all up if you let them, and it's just good tasting native honey.
So Mom told me I got to ask Dad more grafting questions. So Dad, how many cultivars did you start out with when you got into grafting?
Well, when I first started, I started doing the Anabisadori. It was the easiest one to graft, and it had a good thick cambium on each side. And once you get the knack of grafting down, you can move on to more difficult varieties. I did that, Crimson Queens, and some Blood Goods. And one time I had a friend that lived over in Laurel Park, and I went to his place and got some cuttings from Peaches and Cream, Sierra U, and
that's where the original Jade Dragon comes in. Check out our Jade Dragon video.
And as it goes out, you see a tree, you can always ask somebody, you mind if I take a cutting or 2 off your tree? And most people don't mind as long as you don't do a rough cut on a tree. And if you love Japanese maples, you're not going to go in and butcher a tree anyway. You're gonna leave it like you didn't even take a cutting. And that's how I got started, and eventually I had 15 to 20 varieties, and then we would sell them. And over here on the other side is my original greenhouses, these little short hoops. I would crawl out there and get the plants out of a gallon container and crawl back out in the snow and take them in the basement and graft them and take them back in and put them back under the plastic down there. That was before we got big greenhouses. You start off a humble beginning, small, and make it pay for itself as you go. And eventually you got your greenhouse your nursery off the ground, and it's paying for itself.
Dad, thanks so much for letting us get out here in your garden today. I just wanted to get it on camera. I know my girls love talking about it, and I just wanted to get, we're growing some other plants here at MrMaple. It might not be Japanese maple related content exactly, but it's the original OG MrMaple here himself, Norman Nichols, in his garden. And these are some of the plants he's growing these days now that we've kind of taken over the nursery a little bit. So, hey, we greatly appreciate you watching this episode of the MrMaple Show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Like, subscribe, and share. Always sign up for our weekly emails on MrMaple. And I'll let you outro it, Dad.
Okay, I can show you some pumpkin plants right here that my granddaughter planted. And over here is some cantaloupes. We actually ate the cantaloupes and saved the seeds. And you can always save seeds from a lot of your plants that you eat. Your watermelons, sometimes you throw them out in the yard. You water them, take care of them, they'll come on. Some years I've had watermelons better than the ones we bought.
Hey, take care, God bless, and have a great day.